Hi there. A few weeks ago, a chief product officer that I mentor asked me to come and give a talk to their extended sort of team at the company about how to create outcome-focused teams, what needed to be in place for that to succeed. And I gave this talk and I thought I would try to give and record a little version of it here on YouTube. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gift Constable. I'm a former chief product officer, occasionally have been CEO, but mostly I'm a product leader. And so I laid out for this CPO and their company, I laid out sort of three pieces of infrastructure I thought were really important, three things that the leader needed to do, and three things that the teams needed to do. So let's walk through these three things. So let's talk about infrastructure first. What needs to be in place from a broader perspective for product organizations to effectively act as outcome-oriented, outcome-focused teams? The first one is that you need really clearly defined and sort of lined up mission, vision, strategy, and goals. Now that sounds easy, but it's hard to put into practice. Most companies can actually get the mission, vision, and goals right. Most companies are pretty good at saying, here's the numbers we want to hit, here are the goals we want to go after. The trouble is in a lot of places, strategy gets fuzzy. Sort of vision and goals act as a stand-in, and people act like that strategy. But what real strategy is something that allows you to say no. Strategy allows you to make choices. And so, the real need that you have to do as a product leader is push your strategy into those crevices where people are pulled in multiple directions. One of the last places where I was chief product officer was at Meetup. We had, for example, we had a notifications team that we had a huge, enormous notifications infrastructure across mobile, email, driven by machine learning and huge amounts of data that we were intaking and then sending out to our customers all around the world. And we had a team that was trying to we had a very brittle platform that had to operate at very huge scale. And so we were trying to fix that up, but the team ended up finding themselves really caught between some near-term goals for the quarter and the month that the CEO had in mind, some longer term goals that we all were dreaming about how this could be so much better, both for our customer and for the business. And then, of course, there were just some really stressful technical decisions and technical debt issues to deal with. And so they were pulled in these multiple directions. And that was a kind of failure of strategy. Like even how you decide tech debt's going to work, that's a strategy question, believe it or not. You got to push your strategy into that crevice. But the fact that the team was stretched in those three different directions meant that we had allowed ourselves to take the eye off the ball in terms of not clearly defining strategy and goals and reiterating it, right? It's one thing to put it in place. It's another thing to remind everyone over and over again and sort of reorient, regardless of the pressures of the day, of the week, of the month, reorient people around that strategy and goals. So, being really clear about what your playing field is that you're choosing to play on, who the customers are you're really designing for, all these things that can pull teams in different directions. You as a product leader need to clear all that up so that people can have decision-making principles and guardrails. So that's the first. That's the first. The second, and slightly tied to this, is how you structure your teams. So as a leader, you've got to think about, and whether all of product design and engineering reports to you, or whether you're having to work with other leaders of design and engineering to make this happen. But how you structure your product teams and the division of labor across them obviously makes a huge difference. There's, that expression Conway's Law, that product companies ship their org structure, came about for a reason. It's real for a reason. There are, my old colleague, the chief technology officer at Meetup when I got there, Yvette Pasqua, she used to say that you can never escape silos. You just have to choose which silos you're willing to live with. And, that little simple phrase has always stuck with me. I've repeated it to myself and to others many times because, you can't reorg all the time as a leader, right? You've got to choose when you do it. It's quite disruptive when you do it. But how you design your teams to minimize interdependencies and to reduce Conway's Law, to reduce some of the strategic tensions that I was just talking about, is really important. When I first got to Meetup, as to stick with that example, the company had actually tried dividing up the product organization because it was a marketplace, that these people were going to focus on sort of the demand side of the marketplace, and these people were going to focus on the supply side of the marketplace. And from a business perspective, it ostensibly made sense because only one side really paid us money. So you had one side that were important to the marketplace, but the other side were paying customers. The trouble with dividing it up that way was, for a marketplace, you've actually got to make both sides work together really well. Usually one side is slightly more important than the other, but you have to really, really consider how what the behavior that you're incenting on one side triggers the behavior that happens on the other side. And if you get that wrong, then you throw sand in the gears of your marketplace, and all of a sudden it starts to shudder to a halt. And if you get that right and you make both sides really aligned, then this flywheel effect happens that's really quite amazing. So one of the things that I did is I actually reorged very quickly when I got there, reorged teams to actually focus on a problem area and worry about both the demand side and the supply side. And then it was strategy that allowed the teams to think, okay, right now in our context, the demand side is more important or the supply side is more important, because they had a strategy that helped them actually make that decision. But it was key to me in terms of, just shifting so that people were focused on problem areas didn't mean that silos didn't exist, but that was the silo that I wanted to go with, as opposed to breaking up and making foreign. One group focused on one side of the marketplace and one group focused on the other, because the damage I saw, the risk I saw in that approach outweighed the other. So and it's little things as well here, in terms of, like, you try to minimize having teams touching the same parts of the code base at the same time, and obvious things like that. Sometimes you have a problem that's too big for one team. And the key thing there that you need to think about as a leader, as you're thinking about the structure, is just making sure that one brain is in charge of the multiple teams. And to point out a mistake that I've made in the past, when you put someone in charge of multiple teams to ensure that they're not bumping into each other, to ensure that they actually align and work together effectively, you need to make it very, very clear, explicitly clear, sometimes more than once, explicitly clear to everybody that you're counting on that person to be in charge. Because if you don't actually state that, then sometimes it breaks down. So all right, we talked about sort of the mission, vision, values, and strategy and goals, getting that like clearly defined, lined up, and repeated, and then setting up your org structure to be effective. The last one is just about product values. What are the product values that you as the leader say, here's what we think is important. Here's how we want to work. Here's how we aspire to work. Now, it's one thing to lay that out. It's important to lay that out. It's important to define that. It's important to say, we take an outcomes-oriented approach as opposed to just shipping stuff. We take that seriously. But what really needs to back that up now leads into the next section, which is, what do you need to do as a leader yourself? And the first one is model behavior. People watch what you do. They watch where you spend your time. So you can spout all of the values you want, but if that's not where you spend your time, then people don't actually consider it that important. So you need to think to yourself, how do I model that I care about outcome-oriented teams? What are you asking for, right? What are you doing yourself? Are you actually getting involved in the impact modeling, the financial modeling, in pushing your teams? And this ties into the second one. So one is, you're thinking about the behavior that you model and show yourself. And the second one, very closely tied to that for leaders, is, what do you demand of your teams? And of course, what do you coach? Because those two things go hand in hand. So how are you holding your teams accountable? Right? Are you just allowing your teams to come and say, we want to build this thing? Or are you constantly saying, okay, now why? Now I want you to model out the impact. And even though these projections are just guesses, I still want you to go through that thought process to sort of prove that this is important to us. Sort of every meeting, you're making them remind themselves and remind you on the why. Why are we doing this? What is the outcome that we're going for? And when they get stuck, and a lot of junior teams will get stuck on this, they'll get caught up in the features, or they won't know how to model out the actual, numerical impact of what they're going to do is going to be, that's where the coaching comes in. You got to help them through the process. And sometimes that's like coaching them to do it. Sometimes it's a picture's worth 1,000 words moments where you actually show them how to do it. But so you model behavior, and as part of that, you're constantly showing that something's important to you by what you demand and what you coach. So you're spending your time on this, pushing your teams, constantly pushing your teams to focus on the outcomes rather than just the features. And of course, also related to that is, as a leader, providing air cover to allow your teams to focus on those outcomes. So there's constant pressures that are constantly coming up. So with our notification system that I mentioned in the first story I shared, right, I talked about how there were some near-term pressures from the CEO. The company, one of the best ways that the company could sort of goose its numbers was through notifications, whether they're mobile or email or other things. And yet the team was also trying to work on some very big picture things that would impact the company and our customers over the next several years. So how did you navigate that? Um, what you need to do as a leader, the third thing that you need to do as a leader in terms of providing air cover, right? There's always going to be these pressures, right? The head of sales is going to come in with this important contract. There's always things that come up that all of a sudden feel really urgent in the moment. And it's very hard for the teams to navigate that and to make sense of, okay, is this actually more important? And do we actually need to park the sort of more strategic outcomes we were going for? The answer might be yes, but the answer might be no. It's hard for teams to navigate that on their own. It really takes you as a senior executive to work with them, to work with whoever the executive is that's now demanding this new thing, and make sense of it all, right? Sometimes the answer will be we actually do need to park something because something really is important here or now, right? And it just needs to be done. And now we need to rethink sort of questions that we had, this, points that we made around our strategy and goals to take this into account, right? Have we designed it like has this new urgent thing exposed a flaw in our strategy and goals, or is it really just sort of a one-off? Either way, you've got to navigate that. And it may be that there's no one better suited if everyone sort of concludes that actually this is not the right thing, as urgent as it feels, we need to stay the course. We need to stay focused on this really big strategic thing that's going to help our real goals, as opposed to this short-term thing. So, you are the best. If that's a C-suite person making that demand, if you're also C-suite, whether you're, called VP or whether you're a chief product officer, you're the best person to sit down and say, let's, I hear the urgency. I hear where you're coming from. I get that that's important, but let's talk about whether that is actually more important to the point that it should disrupt what we had previously agreed was this big strategic goal that we had set for ourselves. Let's remind ourselves why we were working on this in the first place, what we're trying to do, and let me help you understand the impact that it's going to have to disrupt it, to do this short-term thing. A lot of times, business people that are demanding a short-term item that they want, they're thinking through the thing that they want. They're not thinking through the ramifications. They might not even know the ramifications, right? They're not product and engineering people, but if they're good colleagues, they're willing to listen. And I have found over and over again that these things pop up, but if you just, in a one-on-one setting, pull someone aside and say, let's talk through this. I want to listen to you, but let me share my perspective about what's going on. And very often I have been able to cut things off at the pass and had an executive go, oh, you're right. But as important as this is, what you're working on, this would be too disruptive, and what you're working on is really important for the company. I'm behind it being our future, so I'll just figure out a way to not have this and make it work. That can happen a lot. Again, you might conclude that actually you do need to disrupt the teams, right? Those are just business decisions. But you as the executive need to provide that air cover. You need to be spotting. This is what you're kind of doing all the time. And this goes back to the first infrastructure things. You're just looking all the time for the things that will block and prevent your teams from being outcome oriented, right? It might be the strategy and the goals are not clear enough. It might be that the team structure is getting in the way. But it might also be that you just need to pull some senior executives aside provide the air cover and allow the teams to stay focused on what they're trying to do. So those are three things for the leaders. But let's talk about the teams. The biggest area where I see teams going wrong, trying to be outcome oriented, is they're just not, if I'm really blunt about this, they're just not practical enough. They get caught and lost in a swirl. And one of the most common swirls is wanting to work in the right way rather than working on the right thing. Now, let's just be clear about one thing. I firmly believe that working on the right thing always trumps working in the right way. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe in working in the right way. I care about process. I care about these methods, right? So, you know, I'm always trying to push the envelope and improve how we do our work, but it's always subservient to working on the right thing. And so, you know, if you within the team, you're on the team, realize that you're in a swirl. Could be a lot of different things. Like the team is now fighting over whether we should mob or do pair programming, or every engineer for themselves, right? Or it's how we're doing design. There could be a lot of different things that are causing a swirl. Um, you know, arguments over how much polish something should be or how much tech debt things to be paid down. These are things to navigate. These aren't like fake issues. But the team needs to be really practical and say, what do we need to accomplish? Are we accomplishing things? Are we moving? Are we shipping? Are we heading towards the outcomes that we want to do? And so it's imperative for teams to not get lost in the swirl, to not get lost in vague concepts, to not get lost in the features, but to stay really practical. Tied to that, and the thing that can really help that is just to ask constant questions. So number two for what teams need to do is ask constant questions about your context, about what's going on, about the challenges you've got. And so, are you working on the right thing? That's something you could ask, and you wouldn't ask it on a daily basis, but it is something you could ask on a weekly basis. Now, that might just be that sort of triad that's running the team between the product manager, the design leader, and the engineering leader. It might not be the entire team, right? You're trying to avoid swirl, you're trying to maintain momentum. But asking questions as you go along, do we still believe in this outcome? Are we making progress towards this outcome? Do we still understand this outcome? Do we understand the customers and their incentive structures and their behaviors that is going to lead us to this outcome? So asking just like a bazillion questions as you go along is, I think, important. And you don't want to do this in a disruptive way, right? As I said, you want to avoid swirl, but you still want to ask, like, all you're doing is you're just double clicking quickly, right? Do I still believe this? Yes. Do I still believe this? Yes. Right? Are we asking the right questions? Are we missing anything? No, we're still good. We're still good. But you want to be doing that. You want to just be always aware of your context as a team. That will help you stay the right path. It will help you spot bad things that are coming down the pipe, prevent bad surprises. And honestly, I think that as long as you don't let that become analysis paralysis, and as long as you don't let that become the swirl, I think it can help prevent swirl. The last one is controlling the narrative of the team. So the three things that I think teams really need to do is, one, be really practical, two, ask constant questions about the outcome, and three, controlling the narrative of how the team is doing. It's a mistake for teams to go become a black box, to put their head down and kind of disappear and say, just let us do our work, right? You need to be always controlling the narrative of what you're working on and how things are coming along. A lot of different ways this could manifest. This could be the product managers just making sure that they're navigating executives in the organization and the other pieces of the organization that need to be up to date as to what's going on. Is it going well? Is it challenges? And this could be sit downs with the chief marketing officer, with the head of customer support or success, or this could be all hands or demo days. Like, you could in emails that go out, like, for you decide the medium that works. Chances are you're probably going to need to use multiple mediums and sort of play with it and keep it fresh and try new things, because too much of the same medium, people just start to tune it out. But it's really imperative for a team to control the narrative. And it's really important for the team to control the narrative when challenges come their way, right? So again, back to my first story, that notifications team was like, oh my God, we're stretched in three different directions. We're peanut buttering everything because we're trying to make all three of these goals, like this near-term business goal, the long-term business goal, and the tech debt situation. We're trying to like solve all three. To their credit, they realized that, oh my God, we're actually starting to waste some time. And the product manager bubbled this up to the VP and then to me as the chief product officer and said, help us navigate this. Help us make sense of this, right? This is actually starting to slow us down and get in the way. And then we were able to go do the work with them to say, all right, let's cut through this. You're right. This is too many goals all at once. Let's simplify this and figure out which one. They're all important, but they can't all be equally important. So which ones come first? So they bubbled it up. They asked for help. They advocated for themselves. And to me, that's all part of controlling the narrative. Part of controlling the narrative is, showing off your wins. Part of controlling the narrative is actually sharing the headwinds and the challenges that come, right? If you don't control the narrative, it gets controlled for you. And people start making all sorts of assumptions as to, why this team isn't getting anything done, when actually they're working in something really important that pulled them off of their core goal, the outcome that they were supposed to be going off of. But they and the executives decided that thing was more important. But you have to let people know, or else you sort of get labeled a bad product team. And that's on the team. As I say, the executive can provide air cover and help with that narrative at the C-suite, but for the team needs to control their narrative with their peers and across the organization to the other functions and things like that. So, okay, so I've just blasted through three different items, and just to sort of make it crystal clear in terms of what these items are, I'll just share my screen. The three must-have infrastructure pieces, at least as I think about this right now, are one, that you as a product leader need to make sure that in place you have clearly lined up the mission, the vision, the strategy, and the goals, that they're clear, they're defined, they're actionable, that you've pushed them into the crevices so that people can make decisions. And you're creating decision-making guardrails for the organization. And you're looking for places where people are getting stuck, being pulled in too many directions. And then you're expanding and improving the strategy and goals to make that stuff easier. Number two, team structure and division. How do you minimize interdependencies? How do you put the right people in charge? How do you make it clear that those people are in charge? How do you keep teams from getting in each other's way, right? And how do you prevent Conway's Law and the wrong silos from being a problem for your organization? And then lastly, like, what are the product values? Being outcome oriented is a product value. What are the product values you put in place and preach to your team, which ties into, right, for you as a leader, how do you model those product values? What actions are you taking? Where are you spending your time? How are you demanding these items from your teams over and over and over again? And how are you coaching them and help them so that they, no teams are automatically good at making judgment calls and flipping from being output oriented to outcome oriented. They're going to make mistakes. They're not going to think strategically. They're going to get confused about things. And so how do you help them? How do you bring them along? Your job as a leader, right, is to try to impart and grow really good judgment into your teams so that you can push decision making out. But it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen magically. It takes work from you. And then, of course, the air cover, controlling the narrative for your teams, keeping these blockers and distractions wherever possible, wherever it's the right thing to do, from pulling your team off of the outcome that they're going for. And then for the team, ruthlessly practical. Don't let yourself get caught in the swirl. Keep momentum. Stay practical. It's always more important to work on the right thing than work in the right way. Ask constant questions about the why, not to the point that it creates swirl, right? But that it helps you remember the outcome and it helps you make sure you're working on the right outcome. And then lastly, as a team, controlling the narrative to the rest of the company. So those are 3x3x3 elements that are top of mind for me right now in terms of having outcome-oriented teams. Hopefully this has been interesting. You can reach me at gift.constable@gmail.com if you have any comments, or you can hit me up on LinkedIn. And thanks for watching.